We have three excellent speakers here today. We have David Bailey. Oh, I haven't got anyone's bios in front of me, David.
Sorry.
We have Alan Finlayson from UEA and Natalie Fenton, my colleague here at Goldsmiths. We have about an hour and a half, and then there's going to be the next set of parallel sessions at 3:15. We're aware that this does clash with the football. We value anyone who prioritises our conference over the football. Should it get to penalties later on during the final keynote session, then maybe we'll have a brief interlude so as that people don't spend 50 minutes just hitting refresh on their phones. But other than that, we do hope that you will be able to stay with us for as much of the day as your heart and patriotism and various other things allow. But in the meantime, we have three speakers. And each will speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll go for a Q&A. So I think we're going to start with David. And David has some...
Thank you very much. Great. Good to be here. Thank you very much. And I'm very impressed with people's commitment to be here rather than at the football. It hasn't come out very clearly. What I'd like to do is talk very quickly about Brexit and manufacturing and the need for an industrial policy. Is Brexit an opportunity? Well, it's a crisis, I think. And as Winston Churchill was supposed to have said once, never waste a good crisis. What I want to get to at the end of this, and I'll whiz through a whole load of slides and then spend a bit of time on the need for an industrial policy, is say that, look, if we are to make the most of the opportunities we face and minimise the challenges, we really need to do things rather differently. We've got a constitutional system which was set up largely after the Second World War. It doesn't really work that well. Can we think about more of a federal structure to the UK, including to the regions, where we decentralise as much of decision-making and policy-making as possible? So we probably need, I think, a constitutional convention to do that, and not only a proper industrial policy, but one which is delivered increasingly regionally. Gratuitous self-plug, we had a book out on the political economy of Brexit last year, so some of the ideas are taken from that. We know that the long-term implications of Brexit will depend on a whole load of things, including the trading arrangements that are put in place. We now know what the British government seems to want, finally, although the EU won't accept that, so there's still a long way to go. They'll need to accept various other things like freedom of movement and paying into the budget. And also, the impact will depend in part on the policies pursued by the government. So there could be a range of possible outcomes in terms of its impact on the economy. But most mainstream economists think that Brexit will come at a cost. There's only the economists for Brexit that think there's a positive from this. Of course, that's not the way the BBC present it, is it? There's always, you know, there's a cost, and here are the people saying there's a benefit, Patrick Mingford usually, or a few others. That's not the way that mainstream economists see it. Most economists think that there will be a cost. Those three studies that I put up there, by the way, that all came out sort of back in 2016-17, all suggest that there will be a cost of Brexit. Now, the costs vary, though, depending on the form of Brexit. So they'll range from virtually zero, if we remain in the single market, continue to have free movement of labour, through to very considerable costs if we have a hard Brexit and we end up falling back on WTO rules. And even the Treasury back in the referendum was saying possibly a 6% hit to GDP by 2030. I like that study because that's the one that Gove said we've had enough of experts after they published it. The IFS point to the important point that there's a cost of leaving the single market, potentially of the order of 4% by 2030. Just one other point before I get into some of the sort of trade issues. One thing that's not picked up by the media, I don't think, we usually hear this narrative, well, Germany will want a deal because it sells us more cars than we sell them. I'll come back to that in a moment. But, as many of you know, our exports to the EU account for 12% of British GDP. The EU's exports to us account for 2% of their GDP. We actually need a trade deal a lot more than they do. There is a fundamental asymmetry in the negotiations. This idea we're equal partners is not the case, actually, and we don't really have that much leverage. Remember that Leave's asks were actually incompatible. We were promised a free trade agreement for goods and services and for capital, and restrictions on labour migration, no payment into the budget, and free EU regulation. We clearly aren't going to get all of that. If you want the top two, then you can't have the others, and that still has yet to dawn on the government, even today, nearly 2 years on. So, many of you will know what these different things are, different trade possibilities. As we go from the top down to the bottom, the economic costs stack up. So, could we do a Norway, stay in the single market? We'd have to accept free movement of labour and pay into the budget. Government has said we won't accept free movement of labour, so at the moment that's off the table. Could we do a Switzerland? Trade deals on a sector-by-sector basis. Think of it as a piece of Swiss cheese with holes in it. Bits of the economy covered, others not. Many of you will know that back in 2014, Switzerland voted to restrict labour migration, collision course with the Commission. They had to back off. So if we don't accept free labour mobility, we won't get that. That is largely what the government is now asking for, plus restrictions on labour mobility and not paying into the budget. We ain't going to get that. As you come further down, Turkey has a customs union agreement. They can export to the EU manufactured goods without tariffs. They still face non-tariff barriers. Services aren't covered. Oh, and by the way, there is a regulatory agreement that goes alongside it to make sure that rules of origin are complied with. That is supervised by the European Court of Justice, and guess what? We've said we won't accept that either. So that's not acceptable to the government at the moment. As we come further down, it could be a Canada-style free trade agreement. Government seems to think we might have that, plus other things, getting us up to Switzerland. The EU's talked about Canada Light or Canada Dry, as it's referred to. If all else fails, WTO. Now, May has previously said that no deal is better than a bad deal. Absolute rubbish. No deal is the worst possible outcome. In that case, we'll face tariffs on many things, and in the case of cars, which I want to look at, tariffs of up to 10% on cars and 4% on components. That will wipe out a lot of the mass sector in the UK. So that's why the car industry has been so vocal over the last week. Now, the reason why that's important is politicians think of cars, for example, or manufactured goods as though we make a car, sell it to Germany and vice versa. It isn't like that anymore. You've got multinationals who control supply chains which cross borders many, many times. So GK and Driveline, based in Birmingham, they make the drive lines that connect the engine to the wheels. They're a tier one supplier. They make the final component that goes into cars. So that could go into a car made in the UK or Germany or France or wherever. They use components that come from the UK, France, Spain, Germany, Italy. The components could have crossed borders many times before they came to Birmingham to go into a car that's assembled somewhere else, which may then cross the channel again. The components could cross the channel 5 times. So imagine trying to operate that system with tariffs on components and the final product. It isn't going to work. Just-in-time systems aren't going to work if you've got customs delays. That means a lot of warehousing of components and a dramatic increase in costs. Honda have spoken about 1,200 lorries of deliveries a day to their factory, many of them coming from the continent, 2 million components a day, which have to be sequenced in the right order to arrive at the right time under just-in-time. That is not going to work with customs delays. So there's a very considerable increase in costs if we don't get this right. The car industry was very clear about saying why it wanted to remain in Europe, access the single market, to shape regulations. The UK did that very successfully, actually. Again, something we don't hear about. The UK successfully shaped emissions regulations, single type approval. We're walking away from that. So Jaguar Land Rover will have to rely on the Slovakian government to represent it in the future to shape those regulations. Oh, and by the way, China tends to copy European regulations, so we've walked away from the table that sets the regulations in Europe, which we will have to comply with anyway to sell into it, and also largely in China. There was a feeling as well that we would get better trade deals internationally by being part of a bigger bloc of 600 million people. We may cut quicker deals individually, as an individual country, or not, but it's interesting that Theresa May has been out in Japan saying, whatever the EU gets, we want as well. So that seems to be about the limit of our sovereignty when it comes to cutting free trade deals, I'd argue, piggybacking on the back of what the EU gets. You might as well lock Liam Fox in a photocopying room. It would do us all a favour, probably. 1 in 10 workers in British manufacturing actually come from another EU state. If you go into some of the car factories in and around Birmingham, the supply chain factories, the signs are in Polish as well as English for obvious reasons. And finally, a lot of research and development funding comes from things like Horizon 2020, which is not just about the funding, but about the networks in which they participate. Can we continue doing that? Now, the car industry has been recovering of late. Since the global financial crisis, output has gone up until this year, starting to go back down again. So it's seen as a bit of a successful industry. And I won't bore you with the figures, but a lot of investment has gone in, something like £8 billion in recent years. Big increase in output. It's an industry which has got, ironically, the highest productivity in Europe. It even beats the German industry in terms of labour productivity. And it's been doing very well. Strong productivity growth broadly employs about 800,000 people in the UK. Why has it been successful? Well, every time a car manufacturer makes a new model, it scouts around its plants, it plays off workers against each other and governments. It's a pretty brutal business. There's a locational tournament. Plants in the UK have been successful so far at winning those contracts. Being part of the single market has been absolutely central to that. What's left is genuinely good. It's gone up market. The exchange rate has helped it over the last few years to a large extent, and industrial policy did actually help, which I'll come back to right at the end. So, Brexit, how is it going to impact? Well, through a slowdown in economic growth, and therefore in sales, investment delays if companies hold off from investing because of uncertainty, which they are doing, shifting cost bases linked to exchange rate shifts, and probable export disruption if we face tariff or non-tariff barriers. The exchange rate, by the way, has been really interesting. So, of course, we had that big depreciation, that big drop the day after the referendum. It's now trading at a sort of 20% lower than it was in late 2015, which should be boosting exports. So we should see a boost to competitiveness because of the exchange rate. One of the problems, though, is that because of our fractured supply chains, we import a lot of the components that go into cars that are assembled here. So the cost of those imports has now gone up. There is an opportunity, maybe, I'm trying to be as balanced as possible, to therefore reshore more of the component supplies of components in the UK. But that isn't an easy thing to do. We've looked at manufacturers in the UK that have reshored manufacturing, have brought it back to the UK. And 1 in 6 manufacturers have been doing that. There are big barriers to pushing that further. Availability of skills, access to finance, the availability of land even. So a lot of our manufacturing land has gone. Energy costs. A lot of these are homegrown problems, are the things that we're going to have to tackle in the future if we're going to value manufacture. Also, there's big issues about foreign investment, which I'll come on to, and the issue there is uncertainty. So the uncertainty over our trading relationship with Europe has had a big impact already on foreign investment in UK automotive manufacturing. It's halved as compared to last year, which was a half of the previous year. The major investment that took place last year was by Toyota and its plant in Burnaston to make the new Auris model. That decision was made before the referendum. Companies are effectively sitting on their hands because they don't know what our trading relationship will be. So we've got uncertainty during the talks, which is still ongoing and probably during the transition period, so companies are trying to hold off on investments. And then if we fall out of the EU without proper access to the single market, we won't be as attractive a place to attract that investment in the car industry. Now, uncertainty is the biggest deterrent to foreign investment. If you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, colleagues at Aston and at Warwick have looked at this. The key event that had the most negative impact on foreign investment was Britain leaving the exchange rate mechanism. Not because it said anything about the underlying state of the economy, but because of the uncertainty that it posed. The single event that had the most positive impact was the completion of the single market, because it meant that firms could control their supply chains across border in as frictionless a way as possible. That led to lots of investment in the UK. And the at stake here is that future output. So we've got this window of uncertainty, that sort of red 2-year window. The blue bars are current models of, for example, cars made in the UK. The future production is the blue bars, current models, plus refresh models in green and new models in red. It's investment now, which if we lose it, we'll lose that future production. That could be a kind of scarring or hysteresis effect through the loss of capacity. And being the total geek that I am, these are all the cars made by all the different firms in the UK. So, next generation Astra, due to be made in 2021. Decision on where to make that is due now. Peugeot has said they can't make a decision because of the uncertainty. Nissan has said it will make the Qashqai, otherwise known as the cash cow model, at Sunderland from 2020. I expect them to go through with that, but the next up is the Infinity model. At the moment, I expect that to be cut. Toyota, which said it will make the Auris and the Avensis at Burnaston, has just said it will scrap the Avensis, and so on. So huge uncertainty and a possibility of losing some of these models and therefore plants and jobs in the UK. Now, car companies will look at the UK as against European plants and think, well, does it make sense to produce here? Are we making for the UK market or the European market? Where are we importing the components from? Do we have switching possibilities? Most of them do. There's overcapacity in the industry. They could shift production. Oh, and by the way, it's very easy to sack workers in the UK because of our flexible labour markets. Great at creating jobs, great at destroying them as well. So, the UK position, well, no deal really isn't a good outcome. It's disastrous. If we're leaving the single market, it's likely to increase the economic costs for the economy. Theresa May and the government, I think, have yet to properly understand some of the trade-offs that we face. If we leave the customs union, we're likely to have these quite complicated sectoral deals. It becomes quite difficult to do that when manufacturers increasingly provide services. So if manufacturing is in, but services is out, how's that going to work? A free trade agreement, by the way, also needs regulatory oversight to comply with what's called rules of origin rules, to make sure components come from the UK or Europe. That requires an international referee. that's usually the European Court of Justice. So at some point we're going to have to move on that as well. And finally, I think if we leave the single market, it's more likely we change our economic model because of the impact on the economy, and particularly on Midlands and Northern regions, which are much more vulnerable to this because of their manufacturing bases, and because, as research by Raquel Ortega-Aguirre and Phil McCann has shown, they are less resilient and able to adapt. So the shock is going to be greater for the North and the Midlands. I'll skip over this, but basically, the car industry, for example, as indeed much of manufacturing, is about to be transformed because of the fourth industrial revolution. Things like driverless cars really are coming, a shift towards electric cars, connected cars. I drive electric cars that are connected to the internet. I can control parts of them from my smartphone. If it wasn't too far away, I could summon it, it could come and pick me up. Driverless cars really are coming in your lifetime. We're going to see more change in the industry in the next 10 years than in the previous 100 years. And Brexit could affect investment in a whole load of those different areas. So we could lose that new opportunity, as it were, in the industry. So to finish off, I'd argue we need to nail down the trade uncertainty as quickly as possible, or otherwise the uncertainty will mean a loss of investment and capacity. But if we also think there are opportunities to reshore parts of the component supply chain and to build a new industry in autonomous connected electric vehicles or in other new industries of the future, we need an industrial policy to back that. So if we think that reshoring is important, we need to have targeted policies, things like capital allowances, to enable manufacturers to invest in plant and equipment. Obama, and I know Trump is not a very popular person to refer to, the US government has done that very successfully. We need to rebuild our supply chains, learn from previous mistakes where we abolished things like the Manufacturing Advisory Service and the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative. On skills and finance, we really need to devolve things down to the regional level where manufacturers still have a huge problem about not only accessing finance, but also training workers to get the skills that we want. At the moment, we have a hugely centralised training system. So there's this thing called the apprenticeship levy. Some of you will have heard about it. It's a central pot that money goes into. Manufacturers and businesses see it as a tax. Let's decentralise that down to a regional level so we can make decisions more locally, better suited to our local needs. We could better support our exporters, whether to export to Europe or to growth economies elsewhere. We can think about which parts of the supply chain to target in terms of attracting investment. How do we better support investment? How do we encourage a switch over to the new technologies of the future, things like electric vehicles? And also in the UK, by the way, we have increased energy costs to reduce greenhouse emissions. Absolutely the right thing to be doing to save the planet. Problem is nobody else has done it. So we've put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. Now if we're going to do that, we need to compensate manufacturers in other ways by reducing labour tax or by supporting research and development. My key point to finish off is we really need to be joining up our industrial policy with our technology policy with a place-based approach at a regional level. That's very much what place-based intelligent industrial policy is in different parts of the world. Coming back to this point that we shouldn't waste a good crisis, I'd argue we need a proper kind of constitutional convention whereby we think about what things we do locally, how we redistribute resources from richer regions to poorer regions, and we shift away from what is the most centralised state in the Western world to a more devolved federal system where we can start to do this more intelligently. So on that note, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
That means you can hear me, right? Brilliant. So thank you for inviting me to come and for turning up as well on this lovely day. It's always exciting to be at Goldsmiths. I'm not sure I can offer much in terms of the political economy narrowly conceived in the way that David has just done, because my interest is in political ideas and in political ideologies. And in that sense, I'm interested in Brexit primarily as a sort of way of political thinking, and a way of political thinking that's much larger than simply a policy on the single market or a policy on the EU. And I think it's hardening into a much, or part of a larger set of ideological developments happening internationally, and that's really how I want to think about it. In terms of our topic of opportunity, I'm not really sure that I would use that word in relation to Brexit at all. I guess it's maybe an opportunity in the way that painful, destructive things give you a chance to reassess, but I think Brexit is, for the moment, primarily constraining. It's not a single issue facing British politics, because all areas of policy in the UK are contained within Brexit and will all have to be rethought in relation to it, whatever the shape of any arrangement we make with the EU. And the scale and complexity of that task is already preventing and distracting government from paying close attention to various things it should be paying attention to, and will lead to more of the kinds of cock-up we've seen around train timetabling, universal credit and so forth. And I think any government, regardless of its party, would have that problem. And Brexit will, for that reason, dominate British politics, I think, for a generation at least, as we try and reorient the fundamentals, as you've just seen, of manufacturing and supply chains, perhaps also of agriculture, energy and so forth. Again, I think whatever happens. And those changes will take place, at least in the first decade or so, against a backdrop of continued constitutional instability, political parties that are somewhat disaggregated and confused about their constituencies, changes, possibly the breakup of the UK, and definitely an active, emboldened and growing racist politics, which will be hard at times, I think, to contain. But rather than talk about all those things, I'll talk about them in the context of thinking about the ideological challenges that Brexit presents, as Brexitism and I think Remainerism kind of cohere into ideological blocks that don't quite map onto divisions between left and right, capitalist and socialist, because they are, I think, manifestations of much deeper things going on in the way we conceive of and manage the kind of tensions, the antinomies and oppositions of European Western political thinking. Tensions between particular and universal, liberty and equality, them and us, perhaps even deeper antinomies in the way we organise our thinking about anything, self and other, theory and fact, reason and desire. So in that context, Brexitism and Remainerism, I think, are contingent and specifically English expressions of a much more general ideological political instability evident across the states which form part of the larger European political tradition. They're both incoherent, ideologies usually are. They're messy combinations of different, sometimes contradictory tendencies, but they're not aberrations, and they are connected to, I think, and helping to form social constituencies that are defined in various ways, like occupation, geography, as well as existential orientation, values, and so forth. So Brexit and Remainerism then are rough drafts of something that's going to take a clearer shape in the future, harbingers. But I won't talk about all of that, I'll just talk about Brexitism, and I'll talk about two aspects of Brexitism as an ideology. Firstly, how it tries to organise thinking about the relationship between economic institutions or activities and political ones. And secondly, how it conceives of the future in our political or economic imagination. But I think you'll see that I'm really talking about something larger than English Brexitism all the way through. So start with how it thinks about economics and politics. So the first thing to remember is that a definitive feature of capitalist modernity is the formal separation of the economic and the political. The fact that those who own property don't automatically get to hold political office, that those who hold political office aren't supposed to directly enrich themselves and their families, and the belief that it's best for both realms if political decisions and economic decisions are kept separate, that politicians don't direct the economy purely for political gain, and that economic decisions are market judgments rather than political ones. Now, obviously, that gets violated in lots of ways, but the norm is still strong. We do tend to think that MPs shouldn't get lots of expenses, that it's wrong for politicians to just give jobs to their family, that there should be limits on the capacity of rich people to buy elections, and that political leaders shouldn't get to sell parts of the state to themselves. And in countries like ours, the endless attempt to maintain and establish that division between politics and economics has been definitive, of course, of certainly 20th century political history. Interventions into economic life to make up for the effects of unjust distribution on political citizenship, attempts to then deal economically with the sometimes unintended effects of that intervention, and the social democratic subordination of aspects of economic life in the name of the social, and of course most recently the neoliberal attempt to reverse that and subordinate the political field to the needs of the economy. Brexitism rejects all of that. It doesn't want to redraw the boundary between economics and politics, it wants to abolish it. It rejects it as an analytical tool, arguing that political elites do benefit economically, both presidents and prime ministers who are enriched through hidden or suspect deals, all those critiques of Clinton and Obama as secretly enriching themselves in covert kind of ways, but also, more importantly, the claim that a class, the bureaucrats of the administrative state, manage the economy to benefit themselves and others like them by redistributing public wealth to the public sector, to people like them in their class. Brexitism rejects that division also in terms of policy. It advances a seemingly Hayekian rejection of the idea that elites have the capacity to control the economy, but it also rejects the proposition that economic policy should be politically neutral. It wants political interference in the economy where it serves a specific ethnic or national interest. It also rejects that division normatively. If the liberal ideal proposes that economic decision-making should be purely rational, Brexitism rejects that and rejects the implied neutrality of such decision-making. It's in favour of nepotism. It's morally good to employ your family like Trump does. That's why it doesn't bother them. It makes perfect moral sense to put your family above everyone else. And you ought to be free to discriminate in your hiring practices or in who you choose to sell to. And finally, Brexitism opposes the most fundamental goals of liberal political economy, prioritising things other than economic benefit and growth, morality, identity, purity of the race, the need to stiffen the sinews of the nation. So if you followed some of the reaction to Jaguar Land Rover worrying about things last week, you'll have seen, I think the one that summed it up most was a Brexiter who tweeted at Jaguar, "Fuck off, we don't want your filthy lucre anyway." But you see it also, I think, in some of the left and green Brexitists who also see Brexit as a chance for some kind of spiritual renewal for something more important than economic growth. So what you get then with Brexitism is really an attempt to totally reject the liberal framework of the relationship between politics and economics. But in favour of what? So that links to my second theme, which is how Brexitism thinks about the future, and reformulations of how another fundamental opposition of liberal thought is conceived, the opposition between past and future. For liberalism, of course, the past is a thing to be transcended. It might be how we got here in a chain of continuous development, but we're aiming for a future which we will create and which will be better than the past, which we will discard and put behind us. For liberal and other kinds of democrat, that future is meant to be some kind of collective one, and it can be in some measure collectively willed, and we can devise and implement policies that will bring it about. Now, neoliberal politics, of course, subverted that perspective on the future profoundly, conceiving of the future instead as a territory defined by uncharted risks, to be conquered through the collection and analysis of data, by making psychologically informed predictions, doing the risk calculations and hedging appropriately. And as a mode of government, it redefined the future as nothing but imminent and unstoppable change to which people simply have to adapt. Rather than the outcome of a collective will, the future was reimagined as simply full of risk, with government having perhaps some kind of duty to manage the change, to adapt the behaviour of individuals so that they would be resilient enough to cope. That's what Blairism was. So Brexitism again rejects all of that. It wants a reckoning. It wants, first of all, punishment of those who sought to make the future in their image and to control history, which only the divinity can do. It wants to identify those people, name them, shame them, exile them, whether it's George Soros or amorphous liberal intellectuals or cultural Marxists or people who advocate emancipation, feminists and anti-racists and so forth. It also rejects the very idea of the future as knowable. We can't know what's going to happen. No one can. That's not for experts to say. That's not in our gift. And it rejects even the idea that the future is desirable, not least because it sees the future as promised to us as belonging to others, to the liberals, to the bureaucrats, and so forth. Consequently, from the point of view of Brexitism, the essence of democracy is just the negative expression of the will of the people, the refusal of the futures offered to it, which is also a rejection and a punishment of the class that tries to shape that future. And what that issues in, as you will know, is a call for the reversal of history, for bringing back things that might otherwise have seemed consigned to the past, whether that's established in inviolable gender roles or the fishing industry or whatever it might be. And so Brexitism appears as what Marx and Engels called the feudal socialism of the aristocrats. To quote them, half lamentation, half lampoon, half an echo of the past, half menace of the future. At times bitter, witty and incisive, striking the bourgeoisie to the heart's core, but always ludicrous in its effect, through total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. And in the UK, that takes the form of a desire for seemingly actual aristocrats, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg. In the US, a desire for the new monarchs, the kings of Silicon Valley, like Peter Thiel. But it's also there, more subtly, I think, in the return on both left and right of a certain discourse of sovereignty, desiring the unity and identity of power and authority with each other and with the domain over which they are to have exclusive and unabridged absolute right. So, Is there any opportunity in any of this? I should have said at the start, I'm very gloomy. So Brexitism then is one expression, I think, of a developing and in its own terms coherent critique of liberal modernity, a reactionary one that seeks the return of hierarchy and distinction, which will be fair because they are natural. That critique is built on real contradictions, constitutive of liberalism both as an ideology and as a form of life, and is also in part made possible by neoliberalism, which had tried to resolve those contradictions by overemphasising one side of them, self, liberty, economy and so forth, and created the space for this kind of reactionary formation. Well, maybe there is some opportunity in that then, since there is clearly a void where there ought to be a clear idea of how to organise the relationship between economics and politics and of the collective future which might enable us to bring it about. That's the future, or that I think is the terrain of the ideological level of this dispute, as well as possibly political institutional design. And it's a terrain in which Brexitism, in my view, has to be absolutely faced down. What that means in terms of your view on the Brexit negotiations is a different question, but Brexitism as an ideology has to be absolutely faced down. So in that context, I think it's good news, as we've heard today in other sessions, that people are thinking hard, well and clearly about and experimenting with ideas to do with economic institutional organisation, national investments banks, democratic wealth, forms of employee ownership, and so forth. But I don't think that the political ideological context at the moment is particularly propitious. Because it's so reactionary, Brexitism doesn't have to say very much about how things might be, and that gives it a tactical advantage. Its critique can simply take the form of attacking and dismantling and provoking, triggering the libs on Twitter and so forth. It can be gestural, polemical and performance-based. Its key figures are noticeably very theatrical, playing roles that evoke parts of the cultural collective unconscious and tilting at any windmill it can get us to imagine. That's certainly, I think, characteristic of contemporary political ideological style. Individualised but generic expressions of imagined national ethnic identities taking precedence over the articulation of interests with each other. The counter to Brexitism then can't ape that style in any simple way. To create a real future, it has to know about the things we're trying to learn about today. Hard, difficult things about agriculture and raw materials and supply lines and energy infrastructures and so forth. And it has to know how to actually implement those policies, something Brexitism doesn't have to bother about. But maybe that's where the opportunity lies, to forge new articulations of elements that have become detached from each other. Policy, for the re-establishment of a stable foundational economy capable of satisfying real interests, of organisational forms, political organisational forms that connect people, not rejecting but generating new modes of expertise and collective intelligence, and new kinds of political style and communicative form adequate to the age without losing touch with party form or policy goals. And has to try and do that, I think, not through destroying liberalism from without, as Brexitism desires, but trying to overcome and transcend it from within, which was always the point of socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also to the organisers of this brilliant conference. I know how difficult it is to put on a day like this, and it's an incredible day, so thank you very much indeed, and of course for the invitation. I've been asked to come and speak about the media and the ways in which we are in the midst of a political miscommunication that leads to and has massively enhanced the democratic deficit. So I'm going to try and think that through in relation to Brexit, because of course it's a brilliant case study to do that, and much discussion has focused around in terms of Brexit, in terms of the way the referendum was won, in particular forms and the media's input to that. You'll remember maybe at the time all of the stuff around take back control and research from Loughborough University that showed that the media represented the referendum very much as a Tory story, with far more coverage of the Leave argument. The Reuters Institute itself showed in quite a large-scale study actually of all of the coverage across the media, across the press, sorry, in particular, that they were highly skewed, partisan, treated Brexit as a game or contest, and marginalised voices outside politics. You've probably learnt, in many ways, more about Brexit from the last two speakers then you have 2 years actually of media coverage since, and I want to go on and talk about that too. Because I think it's really important not just to focus on how the campaign was won or lost, but also on how Europe, how the EU has been covered by mainstream media for the past 20 years or so, and then again in the last couple of years. And also the linked issues to that, and in particular stuff around immigration and how that's been reported. Research on how the EU has been reported in the press has been unequivocal. Outside the occasional pieces in The Independent, The Guardian, sometimes The Mirror, reporting has, you will remember, been relentlessly hostile. So, and broadcast media, which you often think comes in as a counter because it's supposed to be impartial, hasn't actually been able to offer that counterpoint. So broadcast reporting tended to be dominated by summits, by disputes between the EU and the UK, or domestic political conflict. So it's meant that when the EU was reported, it's tended to be framed as being in conflictual rather than collaborative relationships with the UK. Laura Bassu's just got a great book out called Media Amnesia, and she looks at the reporting of the Eurozone crisis. So she's looking in particular at the at how Greece was reported, and she shows that just how easily the media forgot the 2008 financial crash as being the cause of the problems in Greece, and focused much more on public profligacy and corruption, returning often to cultural stereotypes of people in those countries as themselves being very lazy and corrupt. So the ongoing problems with the banks, although noted in some coverage, were subordinated very much to public debt. Problems themselves which are often framed as both the source and cause of the problem, rather than its effect. Immigration reporting, particularly in the tabloid press, you will know this, I mean, so I'm not telling you anything new here, has been extremely negative. So we have a whole steady stream of stories, still now very much with us, about immigrants sponging off the welfare state, bleeding the NHS dry, being involved in criminality. And you may say that, well, nobody really believes that, do they? But there's also been studies that have shown that how, when people are asked in a focus group type situation, they will repeat endlessly that actually that they blame immigrants and welfare recipients for the deficit, often repeating stories that they have read in newspapers. Other research by Dhaliwal and Falkert shows that media anti-immigrant campaigns often dovetail with government anti-immigrant rhetoric. So the likes of David Cameron can describe asylum seekers entering the UK from Calais as a swarm, and Daily Express can declare that the migrant surge will raise the toll of UK terror cells. And all of these are, well, not all of them, I say, the majority of this reporting is entirely fabricated. And this is what is kind of endlessly astonishing, really, is that you get constant reports based on very little at all. If we think back to the time just around the referendum campaign, you had The Sun reporting on the great migrant swindle, lies, the great headline in the Daily Star, great, I'm using that euphemistically, Brexit or die and be raped. Remember that one? Apparently a story made by Nigel Farage, but he never used the phrase or even used the word rape. So completely distorted and misleading. I'm picking, cherry picking. I could give you a whole catalogue, right? There's an awful lot of these. You will remember the one also by the Sunday Express. 12 million Turks say they'll come to the UK in Brexit. And then you've got to think that alongside the whole background of fabricated stories about EU's kind of bullying and nannying. So it was in fact Alistair Campbell in his evidence to Leveson who noted that Europe, Brussels or the EU superstate has banned or intended to ban kilts, curries, mushy peas, paper rounds, Caerphilly cheese, charity shops, bulldogs, bent sausages, lollipop ladies, British-made lavatories, the list goes on. And then you've got, you know, when there are attempts to actually make those mainstream media accountable, they have the audacity to turn around and say, don't touch our press freedom. Press freedom is vital to a healthy, functioning democracy. They're inseparable. Don't go near us with your forms of regulation. You'll be massively hindering and damaging the democracy that we hold. In an act of what Victor Pickard, I think, has very well defined corporate libertarianism. And then they also, most recently, can claim that they are the saviours of fake news. Don't listen to what you read on these made-up sites on the internet. We're the real arbiters of truth. You know, and then, you know, you get in this position where actually it's quite, you know, I find it quite astonishing that they're willing to go out and say those sorts of things when actually we have a journalism that is quite the opposite. A journalism that preys on the vulnerable and is frequently discriminatory. A journalism whose noble crusade for truth and justice is often replaced by a carnival of gossip and spectacle, where forms of journalism are wholly committed to market practices driven by desire to ensure profit, rather than the very difficult practices involved in political participation and democratic renewal. And you know, while it's very tempting to say that it's all the fault of the mainstream media, and I think a lot of the fault does land at the mainstream media, I think we should also remember that its power is not totalising. There has been a lot of exposure of its bad practice, bias coverage, illegal practices, distortions, misrepresentations, and I think that has led to a massive growing loss of legitimacy and authority of the mainstream media. So we see frequent surveys around trust in the media that endlessly says we are trusting it much less. So the Edelman Trust Barometer that comes out every year, it surveys over 33,000 people in 28 countries. In 2018, when people were asked to indicate which institution they trusted to do what is right, the media in general came out as the least trusted institution in 22 of the 28 countries. In the UK, if you take all of the surveys on trust together, you will see that trust in general in national newspaper journalism in the UK is low in comparison to other media, to other countries and to other institutions. In the 2017 Edelman Trust Barometer, they said that trust in the media in the UK had plummeted to an all-time low of 32%. It stayed the same in 2018 when only 23% of the UK youth said they trusted the mainstream media. In 2018, of course, when fake news was very much with us, the UK media, and particularly the press, was very quick to point out that in the Edelman Trust Barometer that year, trust in mainstream news went up. But what they didn't report was the disaggregation of that data when that trust was largely located within the BBC, and actually the red tops and tabloids, it had sunk ever further down, but of course they're not likely to tell us that, are they? What is more, 63% of people globally said that the average person doesn't know how to tell rumour from falsehoods. That same survey also revealed that 33% of people are reading or listening to news less, and 19% are avoiding the news altogether because it's either too depressing, too one-sided or biased, or controlled by hidden agendas. Now, it's not good that people aren't reading the news, but you can see where and how that's come from. 66% of people said that news organisations were more concerned with attracting a big audience rather than reporting. Now, that lack of trust isn't unique, and I think it's related also to the same backlash against entrenched interests that has eaten into the credibility of neoliberal political parties and politicians. And given that the mainstream media are seen to be ever more entangled with political elites, they're also implicated in that same kind of mire of corruption and scandal. So if you think back to Rebecca Brooks, the lovely, and her relationship with David Cameron, you will remember that there was, she sent him the following text message. And I repeat this because I still find it shocking, and to me it really sums up where we're still at. So this was sent on the eve of the Conservative Party conference. that David Cameron was about to address. But seriously, I do understand the issue with the Times. Let's discuss over country supper soon. On the party, it was because I'd asked a number of News International people to Manchester Post endorsement, and they were disappointed not to see you at the party. But as always, Sam was wonderful, and I thought it was the old Etonians that were charm personified. I am so rooting for you tomorrow, not just as a proud friend, but because professionally we're definitely in this together. Speech of your life, yes, he can. That's kind of indicative of a culture of press-politician mutual interest that actually Alan was referring to in that kind of political elites. You've got media executives and party leaders working together to push the same agenda. You'll remember the question that was put to Rupert Murdoch when he was asked, why does he oppose the EU so viciously? And he said, it's simple. When I go into 10 Downing Street, they do what I say. When I go to Brussels, they don't. So, you know, there's that. I mean, you can take that as you will, but there has been a steady flow of newspaper executives in and out of Downing Street, regardless of which government of the day it has been. We also have a further problem, and I realise I'm probably dashing with time now, so I'm going to whip through this quickly. But we have a concentration of media ownership, and this was the link to Rupert Murdoch there, which also brings a massive concentration of power, and that is the problem of the relationship with political elites, because they feel they have to constantly work with that concentrated power blocks in order to get elected. So the UK has a supposedly competitive national newspaper market, but just 5 companies, presided over by tax exiles and media moguls, control 90% of daily circulation and help to set the agenda for the rest of the new media. That's complicated yet further when you add in things like Google and Facebook, where Ofcom show that high levels of news consumption come through those third-party platforms. So Facebook is fast becoming the dominant digital platform for news. But what happens on Facebook, of course, is a personalisation of that content. So according to what you are doing in your digital spaces, Facebook will feed you the news it thinks it's appropriate for you to see. 90% of global desktop search comes through Google, and Google and Facebook together account for around 2/3 of all digital advertising in the US. Now, of course, Facebook changed their algorithms in response to fake news, but in doing that, what they did was actually reduce the amount of news that came into people's news feeds and doubly reinforce mainstream news agendas, because that was the ones that could be seen as being most reliable. So, you know, you get a double whammy there. It's not that, sorry, time up. So I'm going to very quickly talk about what we can do as a consequence, what comes next out of Brexit. So I think there are real opportunities. I think there are things that we can do in the media environment. I work with the Media Reform Coalition and with Hacked Off, and there's lots of things that we've been trying to do in terms of developing an entirely new environment, media ecology, within the UK. That requires new laws around media concentration, so limiting concentration that we have now, preventing further media concentration in the future, and supporting and seed funding pluralism from the grassroots. That does mean things like media cooperatives, of which are growing. You've got the wonderful Bristol Cable. It means workers' cooperatives, like you've got the Highland West Highland Free Press, Camden New Journal. It means things like readers' cooperatives. It can mean things like public commissioning of content. You've got investigative journalism site in Scotland called The Ferret, who does a public commissioning model. It will mean that we will need better regulation of journalism itself. The current regulatory model has failed, and I can talk more about that in the future if you want me to. But I do think there is a mood to tap into something which is more akin to a solidarity economy or a citizens economy in all of these new shoots of growth that are coming through. The BBC also, of course, needs massive reform. And I know The Guardian is currently thinking about what it should be doing. So there are real possibilities if we get a Labour government.
Great. So we need another chair. We have half an hour. We've had three very different, but all coming at Brexit from relatively different perspectives, different aspects of Brexit, but all very, very provocative and immensely relevant to day-to-day events at the moment. So let's just start off. We'll take sort of 2 or 3 questions at once. I can see a couple of hands up. Right? Okay? So we'll start there and then go back again. Yeah. So, sorry. There's a gentleman with his hand up there.
Hi, my name's Frank. Thanks.
Oh, that's not on it, is it?
Hi, my name's Frank. Thank you for 3 very insightful talks. But I must admit to having been a bit disappointed not to have heard the word empire mentioned once, and not to have put Britain in a far more global context. And I'm also disappointed not to have heard more criticism of the EU. David, in your talk, you perhaps understandably used the pronoun we quite a lot. And whilst it is an understandable shorthand, I think it is one that's worth interrogating. Does that we include, for example, Republicans living in Northern Ireland? What does the prospect of a United Ireland, how does the prospect of a United Ireland feature in your analysis? How does the fact that the UK, which remains, as far as my analysis is concerned, the metropole of a violent global empire, how does the fact that it stands to self-destruct, how does that affect your analysis? Is it true, I think it's true, that the British working class has always benefited from empire, and whilst the collapse of that empire, or the seismic, chaotic intrusion of Brexit into that imperial apparatus might well pose the risk of fascism emerging within the British working class, surely it falls to us on the left to fight that risk of fascism, even as we at least critically welcome the possibility that the British Empire might be in the stages of decline, and more importantly that analysis applies at the European level. Who is this we? Is it a white European we? And are we witness?
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Is this addressed to the whole panel, or is this just?
I guess it's addressed to David, but also to the whole panel. Yeah.
Right,
basically, so to conclude, then the opportunity, as I see it, is that it will weaken the European economy, which is a good thing. It will weaken the European economy's war-making ability, and we might get a United Ireland and a collapsed UK out of it. What do you think about that?
Fine. Okay. Right, we've got a question at the back, and
Great question.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. Question about Brexit in relation to Britain and the traditional issue of the concert of Europe. If Britain is not connected with Europe as it has been with the EU, is it to be expected that Britain will carry out its traditional role of, how to put it, disrupting Europe and its relationship with Russia? I'm no expert on the history of European history, but we have seen in the last 12 months a ramping up of the rhetoric, oh, Russia is our new enemy, etc., etc. Is this in any way related to Brexit? And what does that mean economically? Thank you.
okay. Any questions about the topics in the talks? Yeah.
Thanks for those papers. It was the second paper I had a question about, and so my interpretation then is Brexitism then very different from a vote for Brexit. So does Brexitism actually have a sort of a constituency, or is it just a protest vote?
Okay, so we've got David. Why don't you start, because I think you were invited to comment on the question of empire and the benefits of a European economic decline.
Okay, great question. Don't know how to answer it. You caught me out on we, absolutely right. A weaker European economy, would that be good, really? I'm not sure that's going to benefit anybody. Europe has profound issues, particularly over Eurozone governance and inbuilt monetarism that needs to be reformed so you get a credible economic policy that can deliver growth, inclusive growth across Europe. Because at the moment they don't have it. You've got as many of you will know, a currency which isn't an optimal currency area. You've got Greece in particular, which has been at the forefront of appalling austerity and misguided politics, represented very oddly by the media, you're quite right. And there needs to be fundamental reform of the Eurozone, and ultimately maybe even a separation of the Eurozone into a kind of a core and another group with different currencies, possibly. But I'm not sure a weaker European economy is actually good for anybody. It wouldn't be good for us. In terms of the self-destruction of the UK, yes, we may well see it if these tensions play out. Most obviously in the Irish case, but also possibly in the Scottish case. And I would argue that we need to change our constitutional system if not only we want to hold things together, if we want to, but also to try and deliver an ability to people to have more of a say over their lives and tailor economic policies to their own suiting. Russia, no idea.
I don't know how to answer that. But maybe I can say, it's an interesting question. It is something I have thought about a lot. And particularly, I'm in a project at the moment which is looking at civil society futures around England. I'm doing deep dives into 9 different communities, many of which voted heavily to leave. And what's interesting there for me is that they're facing many of those places, and I know this is a rhetoric that's been said time and time again. I'm not saying this is the reason they voted, so please don't assume that's the case, because I don't think it's that simple. But what stories are coming out of there are that they are facing what now, local authority cuts with 49.1%, the latest that they had to cut. The prediction by 2020, that goes up into the mid-50s. So these are places that are decimated. And it's actually been a huge eye-opener to me, and a massively kind of depressing, but also really inspiring, because where there is racism in those places, and they talk about community conflicts along lines of racism, there is also real effort and energy going into how to reimagine what their communities can do and what they can look like. And they are talking about the new type of municipal socialism that you're seeing out of Preston, even though I think there's lots of flaws in the Preston model. They are talking about, you know what, they don't give a shit about us. We've got to figure a way of doing this together and sorting stuff out. And that means reclaiming a local democracy. It means ensuring that there is some means of both accountability and equality in resource distribution across that. So there's also, and they're working with these problems. They're figuring out how to change it. And that's why I ended with saying I'm a bit hopeful. And that's why I think some of the new stuff will start locally. It'll be about local news changes. So I think that is really an important and interesting question. In relation to Russia, the only real thing I can comment on is, of course, fake news was blamed on the Macedonian cottage news industry. And that was, apparently where it started. But that's a kind of obvious endpoint for a commercial internet. So, of course, that's where you get to. So the counter to that is, if we want to stop that, it's not, for me, in a kind of media and communications terms, it's like, well, actually, what you need to do then is nationalise search. You need to create a public interest media communications system. You need to make sure that your algorithms are run for public interest ends. You need to make sure that big data is collected just for public interest purposes. That then entirely changed that system and those
relationships that can be given those particular positions globally?
So I'll just address the last question then. Yeah, so without disregarding Brexit, which apparently means Brexit, I wanted to draw attention to the way in which something has formed around or out of that, which is larger than and perhaps a bit different from, and it now has a logic of its own that needs to be understood, in a sense, separate from the specific details of what happened at Chequers yesterday, for example. And anyway, we know that that's the case because we know that lots of people voted for Brexit for all kinds of reasons: immigration, employment issues, general senses of alienation, and so forth. And a part of what Brexit did was allow all of those different tendencies to be crystallised, but they were crystallised around a very particular set of claims for why they were experiencing the things they were experiencing, and that's given rise to an ideology which is pretty clear, I think, in terms of advocating something like a version of racialised sovereignty, intense hostility to the so-called new class, the bureaucrats and the intellectuals and so forth, and is using that, has united people around that, and is pushing an aggressive politics of that nature, which is international. There is a conservative international, as it were, which shares an awful lot of common ground in terms of what it wants, in terms of national sovereignty, racial divisions, and hostility to a certain kind of liberal bureaucrat class. That's there, that now exists, and that has to be understood. Your question was what's constituency, and in part it's created its constituency. That's part of what politics does, but it's created that constituency out of a wide range of different sub-fractions that we kind of know about in relation to Brexit, though we don't know where it's all going.
Right, another round of questions, yeah, and let me just see, any men so far. Yeah. I mean, there's not much I can do about that. But
I've worked with class as a diversity.
Good. The first hand that went up was there, and then it was there. But yeah.
Yes, a question for David, and sort of going back, as much as I've been really enjoying the discussions of ideology and media, but back to some sort of economic nitty-gritty. A lot of my work over the last 10 years has been in the regions with clusters, yep, accelerated programs, incubated programs, etc., many of which are funded by EU, yep, particularly RDF money. You had a small bullet point about R&D, but I think it's a big issue, and I wonder what you thought the impact would be post-Brexit of that funding not being there. What's the impact on our industry and economy?
Great. And then there was a gentleman with a laptop here.
Yeah. So yeah, very interesting presentations.
There's a mic on its way, by the way. Just
sorry. Yeah, interesting presentations. In terms of the second one, I very much enjoyed how he explained there was complex reasons and nuances for people who voted to remain or leave. And then what was very interesting in the third presentation, which I enjoyed the most, about the non-mis and disinformation in the mainstream media, that obviously informed the way that people voted. And then in terms of what we get, what happens, that's very much going to be informed maybe by non-mis and disinformation, as opposed to true information about the world, its problems and its causes. And in terms of those outcomes, we could have a couple. One which is very narrow, economic growth is really important, believe that that's a panacea, capitalism's great, it all trickles down, or something you'll hear about later in terms of degrowth. So decoupling well-being, quality of life from fossil fuels, from capitalism and things like that. Not sure there's a question there, but I'm sure you can probably share some thoughts. Thanks.
Anyone else have any? There's a lady there in the pink top.
One of the things that I noticed during the debates that were leading up to the referendum was the, and maybe this is my lack of observation, but there seemed to be a very, very little exposure of left-wing arguments for Brexit. And possibly also a symptom of the level of debate, and I don't think I've seen a debate of a lower level ever than the one leading up to the referendum. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts about where those arguments were then and where are they now?
Right, so we've had three, and the first one was directly at you, David, actually about the R&D. So why don't you address that?
Sure. Yeah. Good question. I did skim over. It's a very good point. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of investment that's come from various European bodies into British industry, whether big firms or clusters of smaller firms, and of course into our university system. We've done incredibly well at winning research grants. Interestingly, Breitbart had a real go at myself and another guy, Aston, for getting lots of money from Europe and therefore being biased on top of our salaries, it said, as though it was going into my back pocket, if only. So I stuck that out, put it on my wall. I was so proud of it. Interestingly, one that's not picked up so much is the European Investment Bank, and you have to be a member at the EU to be a shareholder and therefore get funding. Huge amounts of European Investment Bank funding has gone into the car industry in the UK to develop low carbon industries, Rolls-Royce, Airbus, all sorts of other things, as well as infrastructure. So there's going to be a big issue. And we're going to have to find ways to not only replace that, but do new things that we want to do, whether that's a national investment bank, regionalised investment banks. Remember back to the global financial crisis, which the media have forgotten about. Gordon Brown at the time talked about changing the banks that we'd nationalised to make them into investment banks. Well, we forgot about that, didn't we? So it'd be good to go back to have a look at some of that. And you're right, a lot of the investment that has gone into places like Birmingham has actually come from Europe. Go back to the 1980s, it was the local council which had to bypass Thatcher to build links with Europe to get European money in to rebuild the city. Not something that was talked about much in the media, but if you go to the back of the International Convention Centre at Birmingham, right in the bowels of the building, there's a tiny little European flag saying part funded by the EU. It's not something we properly understand. And ironically, it's the Leave voting regions which are economically weakest or most vulnerable to the loss of that funding.
Thank you. In relation to the questions on the news and the issue around, I'm going to link it to an issue around regulation, then talk also about slow news. But currently, most of UK mainstream news is regulated by an organisation called IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation. IPSO is run by the industry itself. So Paul Dacre sits on the Editors' Code Committee, chairs the Editors' Code Committee. Last year, IPSO received 8,148 complaints about discrimination. They upheld one of those complaints. And the reason for that is the Editors' Code excludes you making a complaint around discrimination if it's not about a named individual. So if it's about migrants or women or trans people, you can't make a complaint. It has to be about a named individual. So it all gets thrown out. So, and they know that. They know that's why they write the code that way, in order to license discrimination. That's what they're doing, effectively. So, you know, that, and that's why they all sign up to IPSO. Now, there is another press regulator called Impress that has a different editor's code that doesn't have that clause in it. So, you know, there are choices that are being made here and pressure that can be brought on those organisations, particularly in legislative ways, in order to make sure there are more sticks rather than carrots to persuade them to join those regulators. There are also other movements like slow news. You were talking about different forms of the economy. Now, slow news is a really important thing because actually one of the problems with news is that it is now churned out at such speed because it has to fill so much space with online. There are fewer journalists to do it because the business model has crashed through the floor, because most of the advertising that used to underpin it has gone to things like eBay. So, you know, so what you get is lots more news being created by far fewer journalists to cover much more space in far less time. And so it's checked very, very rarely. In fact, the journalists in one study we did, when you said, did you verify that? Oh, we didn't need to, we just stole it from the Daily Mail. So that was, you know, you're getting that type of reproduction endlessly, which is a major problem. In terms of left-wing debates in the media, it's a really important question. And we've been talking a lot and writing a lot around how, you know, kind of the liberal media, so-called liberal media, is no longer occupying that space. So you've got, I mean, media concentration of ownership is obviously one big issue, but when you get to something like the BBC, you don't expect that to happen. And yet they've effectively silenced, really, any counter-Brexit arguments in many ways, and the Lexit argument. So they've done both things. So Danny Dyer, when Danny Dyer comes out and says, nobody has a clue what the customs union is or what the consequences are, what's going on, he's right. You know, the debate has been appalling. It's been really appalling. And that requires massive reform within inside the BBC that is still, I'm going to get this wrong, so I'm making this up, but it's more or less in this region. It's something like 60% Oxbridge graduates still in the BBC. You know, so you still, you know, it's dominated by a very particular type of person, which itself creates all sorts of problems. Now, it's not just that if you transplant one person with another, you'll change the content, but it's got something to do with it. If you go onto the Media Reform Coalition's website, actually, there's a great paper on reforming the BBC that goes through all those issues.
Just to say a bit more about the question on the left argument for Brexit, where was it? We'd have to find out a lot more about what you think the left argument for Brexit is, because there certainly were prominent, or Labour members of Parliament were prominent on the Brexit side and participated in very high-profile debates. And within the kind of left media, there were, again, prominent Brexit voices. The Blue Labour tendency is very much a Brexit position. It depends whether you think it's left-wing or not. There is a kind of academic argument which couches itself more in kind of what would seem like traditional left conceptual terms, in terms of emphasising ideas of popular sovereignty and economic nationalism and so forth. But that was never really going to be very prominent because it couldn't take the form that would be required by the Brexit referendum. It was a very narrow and specific set of arguments about constitutional arrangements, whereas the Brexit campaign, as I was suggesting, was about a whole lot more. But you also asked, where is it now? Isn't it advising the Labour Party? Isn't it quite an important part of the groups around Labour? I think it is. I think it's probably, if it's not clear from my position, I think having any truck with Brexitism is absolutely disastrous. There's nothing positive in it. It's a wholly reactionary formation, and left people engaging with it for their own reasons are going to be crushed by it.
Okay, do we have any? We've got round time for one there. I actually have a question, but maybe. Okay, go ahead.
So this is really for David and Natalie, I guess. So I'm from Wolverhampton, so car manufacturing is a quite big thing around there. I think there's a really big plant in Dudley.
Yep.
And probably about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a big investment in that area. Can't remember the exact details, but in the last 20, 30 years, despite that investment in car manufacturing, parts of Wolverhampton still saved as bad as they've been since Thatcher destroyed the industry around Wolverhampton. Bilston is an incredibly deprived area of Wolverhampton. So I guess when I hear these things about car manufacturing and things that we can sort of do, what I can hear is the fact that these sort of technocratic arguments are things that actually aren't really getting us very far. Like, it may be that we can reform the way that we restructure our capitalist system with some more socialist values. However, we're all still part of the rat race, which sort of underpins that. And actually, maybe we're a little bit sick of that. And to sort of bridge it with Natalie talking about communication, if it is difficult to actually communicate these ideas about how we reform the problems that we're in, then how do we talk to people who have been shut off by the experts?
I wanted to put a question to the panel as well, and I don't know if it's playing devil's advocate or not, but which is that Britain pre-2016 had a kind of a decade of crises of elites and of legitimacy, and of course that included the hacking scandals, but it also included the financial crisis, which turned out to also be the pinnacle of a sort of series of moral crises like LIBOR, there was, I've thought of how to connect this to cars, actually, David, which is, there was the VW emissions. That was a huge loss of trust. There was, turned out Tesco's were lying about their profits in an institutionalised way. PwC, KPMG, all of these sorts of kind of middlemen were helping people in London, sort of footloose citizens of nowhere, rip everybody off. The MP's expenses scandal, I think, was probably one of the most important, devastating, destructive political events of recent, perhaps of the post-war period, actually, in terms of how it changed most people's views of what goes on in Westminster. So the fact that Farage is able to get traction by talking in the way that he does may say more about the truth of the British establishment than it does about Nigel Farage. And that, I mean, of course the media are one of those people, and everybody loved that summer of 2011 as we got to find out quite how crooked the whole thing was, and now they put it all back together again. But nevertheless, there was year after year after year, in that weird interregnum between 2008 and Lehman Brothers and 2016, every single year there was another one of these things. And I think, finally, a sense of trust just kind of collapsed in a way.
Yeah. Natalie, why don't you start with any of that?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting when going around these 9 local areas that we've been talking to, that sense of abandonment by the political elites, essentially, and complete lack of, there's nothing there that, why on earth would we ever trust them to do anything ever again? And it's not just the politicians, it is all elites in with that. So it's, when you talk to them about, their local industry, and this comes back to your point, it's like, well, we don't actually even trust the local banks to do stuff. It's actually, we need an entirely new system behind that. And when you say, where does that come from? I do think it can come from cooperative run media systems. If you look at things like the Bristol Cable, which has a membership economic model where people pay very little, £2.50 a month, to be a member, and they can also write for it, they can bring stories to bear, they can decide which sorts of things that need to happen where. But also, so I think that's a possibility, but I also think the people we're talking to say, actually, we don't want it online, we don't want we don't want it by the big organisations that we don't trust, don't even trust the big charities because they've lost trust as well, they're part of the establishment. Actually what they want, and they talk rather creepily, I think, of it being eye to eye and thigh to thigh meetings. So they want to sit down and talk. They want to meet people and talk and debate stuff. And this is where, going back to the whole idea of town hall meetings and general assemblies and bringing people together to discuss these issues which are key to their local communities, and only they feel only they have the knowledge to actually deal with and sort out properly. Now that can be very misconstrued in lots of ways, but it came over very, very forcibly that in terms of trust, the trust will be rebuilt locally. It will start there. It won't, there's a long way to go, and I think the local media, if they do it right, could play a part in that. I think some national media, if they did it right, could play a part in that. I think The Guardian could do interesting things if it was so minded. It could set up local Guardian assemblies. It could set up, a readers' cooperative. It could say there's all sorts of things it could do. But I think that's where the mood is in the places I've been, and so that's why although it's really depressing, it's also interesting to see where it could go.
Shall I go? Well, I don't really have a lot to add to what Will said. You're absolutely right. There was a broader, deeper delegitimation of an entire system going on. But I suppose, to add something to it, I guess I would say, I think it's important to see that crisis wasn't just a crisis of, I don't think anyone here would think it was, just of a few personnel, but a much deeper coming apart of a larger ideological, political, cultural system. And what part of the success of the right has been to name that crisis as being kind of metaphysical in nature, as not just being accident, but being part of a deeper sickness intrinsic to liberalism as such and its view of the universe, and to connect that to people's resentments and existential unhappiness in the world as it is. and has done that successfully in a whole range of places. In Hungary, obviously, in Brexit and Trump, crystallised that, and because they gave it a demonstration that it could win, have been incredibly powerful accelerants of it.
Yeah. David, did you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Come back on it?
Thank you. Yeah, great question. I was born in West Brom and grew up there and in Stoke-on-Trent. There we go, you see? Fantastic. And then I've worked for a long time in Coventry, so I've been on a tour of deindustrialisation hotspots in the country for most of my life. Yes, you're absolutely right. So there has, on the one hand, been big investment by the likes of Jaguar Land Rover in the I-54 engine plant and so on. Okay, but amidst a sea of deindustrialisation, where and we spent a long time, for example, tracking what happened to the MG Rover workers after the company went bust. 3 or 4 years on, average incomes had declined. There's a big spread of income. Many workers had to retrain to go into services which paid far less money. They were working part-time in supermarkets, and so on and so on. So there is this sort of general feeling, I think, in parts of those regions about being left behind. So it was many things, but it was partly, I think, a protest at globalisation. It was partly a protest of being left out. Now, Brexit isn't going to help that in any sense. It's going to make it worse in many ways because the economic impact will be felt most there. And the question then is, well, how do we listen to what they were really telling us if we can untangle what they say? I think it was partly about the need to sort of, if we think about the words take back control of their own lives in many ways. And that means giving people the freedom to do things positively. So, and linking with your point, Guy, what has globalisation been about to a large extent? It's been about negative freedom for elites within transnational firms, free from government control. So can we think about an economic system which is free in another sense, which is more about the sort of Sen idea of capabilities and allowing people, or enabling people to make decisions and do the sorts of things that they want to do? That would require wholesale change to the economy. I still think there's a role for manufacturing capitalism within that, but also economic diversity, including different forms of ownership, and including, by the way, the foundational economy, the sorts of stuff that Carol Williams has been talking about. So I'd like to see a diverse economy, not just in media, but also in the broader economy.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap things up there. I wanted to just quickly pass on Faisal Sheehan's apologies for not being able to join us today, which is because she's becoming the prospective parliamentary candidate for Walthamstow, hopefully going to unseat Ian Duncan Smith. But that means that Chingford. Oh, right, Chingford. Is it not there? I think there is someone she's hoping to. Okay, I completely invented that. Sorry, Chingford. Chingford. Of course, you're Walthamstow, aren't you? That's Stella Creasy. Sorry, Chingford, but it is Ian Duncan Smith. No. Sorry, of course. Sorry. Anyway, but that's the main point being that unfortunately that she's prevented from, or she felt she couldn't be speaking on this topic while she was in that position. Anyway, it is 3 o'clock. I can't think of anything better to do for the next hour and a half. And there is a series of sessions from 3:15. If you do have to discreetly and sadly and so on slink off somewhere, it would be terrific if you were to come back for the final session at 5 o'clock. And for those of you who are going to stick with us, then we're tremendously grateful for your commitment and loyalty. But most importantly, I want to thank our 3 terrific speakers for some fantastic...